Dark Souls is one of those games that, even if you haven't played it, has probably been osmosised into you at this point. The thing is that when people talk about the Souls games, it's usually either about the great way they build their lore, or about how they're so hard. And honestly, I think all the discussion about the difficulty is kinda reductive. Reductive to the point where I think a lot of why they're considered memorable is succeeding in the face of a high difficulty bar. And hey, the classic Blighttown lag may be a distant memory, but that doesn't mean I'm not still throwing myself off ledges. I think ultimately beyond all that, it's what Dark Souls 1 does differently than every other Souls game that I find most memorable. Now, sussing out which Souls-like game people remember the best might be a contentious subject, but I kinda doubt I'm gonna get a bunch of people screaming at me if I assume there's a lot of nostalgia associated around Dark Souls 1. There are plenty of hard games, there are plenty that IV drip lore into you, there are plenty of games about memorizing enemy attack patterns. What I really think sets Dark Souls 1 apart is the lack of fast travel for the first half of the game. This lack of a feature puts player progression and the consequences of those choices directly into players' hands. I remember kind of vaguely hearing about how a lot of new Dark Souls players kept running into this graveyard area next to the starting hub. And they quit the game because they just kept dying over and over again to these bone guys. Turns out you really don't even need to go here till the second half of the game. In fact, there's a ton of places to go just in the starting hub. I guess I should briefly mention for anyone who has somehow avoided being exposed to any Dark Souls content, these bonfires are basically your checkpoints, and when you eventually get the ability to fast travel, these bonfires are what you warp between. But in Dark Souls 1, there are also a whole lot more. This is an action RPG, and so an important element is going to be building up different aspects of your character. But what Dark Souls 1 does so well is integrate that character building into the very environment itself. Because there's no bonfire warping till the second half, every journey out of the hub feels like its own little expedition. You can't warp back, and if you die, you gotta go to the last bonfire you were at. So at a certain point, taking one of the many, many paths the game makes available right off the bat, you're going to reach a realization where if you want to go back to an earlier or different area of the game world, you're going to have to run or fight your way back. Now this can be super annoying. Most people hate backtracking, and for good reason. But the devs knew this and threw in a ton of shortcuts and secrets and loop-de-loops. If you just keep pushing forward for long enough, you'll find a path back. And as you unlock all these shortcuts, you're essentially upgrading your bonfire. The more elevators and ladders and etc. you can open up, the more valuable that bonfire becomes. On top of which, you can upgrade the amount of Estus Flask uses each bonfire restores.
If you've never played Dark Souls, that basically means you can get more health out of your checkpoints.
But the items you need to use for this are limited.
Unless you want to grind rats.
So if this is your first playthrough, spending resources on the right bonfires becomes almost as important of a choice as what stats you put your points into. You don't know what's coming up. Maybe burning your poor humanity in this bonfire will be a complete waste. If you die a bunch in an area, maybe you just need to learn it better, or maybe you really do need some more health refills. This mechanic perfectly synergizes with the shortcut design, because suddenly that bonfire you kept feeling like you wasted all these resources at gets a ladder kicked down to it. I think it helps a lot to make players feel less stupid on their first couple playthroughs. I know when I first beat Dark Souls 1, I had no idea what I was doing. And having choices I made that seemed stupid in hindsight suddenly benefit me later in the game really helped immerse me in the world and give me more of a push to finish it. In Dark Souls 1, I feel a lot more like I'm shaping the game world around me just as much as it's shaping me playing it, like a tug of war. Honestly, I have no idea why this take on Metroidvania-style design just got dropped for the sequels. It's super baffling to me. Speaking of things the other games dropped, let's go back to that initial hub area. When you first start the game, you got this sort of tutorial area to go through initially. Then, you get to Firelink Shrine. There's something you'll notice is missing right away if you play the other Souls-like games, but not DS1. There's no level-up NPC. Now, for other franchises, this isn't a big deal, since a lot of RPGs just let you level up wherever. But for Souls-like games, that's not at all the case. Usually there's some lady standing around that'll just make you more buff if you give her thousands of souls. But in Dark Souls 1, because there's no warping from the start, that'd be insane. Since you can lose your souls anytime you die, the game encourages you, especially the first couple playthroughs, to be really cautious with your souls. You even find multiple types of rings designed around just keeping your little sack of people clouds through death. So this means in games like Demon Souls, Dark Souls 2, 3, and Bloodborne, you're constantly warping back to your main hub to cash in all your earnings before something stupid you do snatches it all away. But in Dark Souls 1, you level up at bonfires. You just dump your souls into the fire and there you go. This changes the pacing so drastically that it feels almost like playing a game made by completely different people. You can't just bamf out of any area you want, try a different path, or go get your gear upgraded or something for a tough zone. You have to plan ahead what you're going to need, and use the environment to try to guess how likely this path will take you into some horrible area, or if you're just going to loop around really quick. Maybe you checked out the next area, backed out because it was too hard, so you went and got some upgrade materials to make your sword betterer. But maybe you also only had enough upgrade resources to make your weapon a little better, and you're just one away from that next upgrade. Or maybe you just think the further you go, the tougher it'll be, and you don't want to have to run all the way back just to upgrade your stuff. So just buy a box. Now you can upgrade most of the stuff yourself at any bonfire. And a lot of this works really well because of the map Dark Souls 1 is designed around. A lot of routes you can choose, and even quite a few shortcuts will have sort of transitionary areas separating things. You don't just get to shortcut from Blighttown back to Firelink Shrine. You've got to ride this wheel thing, get past all these toxic buckethead guys, and then go through this valley. This game's designed to be a trip. It's a journey. You don't have a home base that you can just jet out of quickly to beat bosses. You have to carry your home with you into any kind of environment the game throws at you. And I also think that's part of what makes the starting hub so memorable in Dark Souls 1. You're really not there that often, especially compared to other Souls-like games. It's where the game basically starts, where you first get freedom to choose your path, and it starts with an upgraded bonfire, so you're going to be spending a decent amount of time at the beginning. But most of the time you're going to be spending in Firelink Shrine is just passing through. And because of that, it develops such a comforting atmosphere over the course of the game. In a lot of games, you spend so much time in your main hub area, doing the exact same things in it over and over, to the point where I think a lot of people just tunnel vision to the NPCs they need and then leave. Dark Souls 1 completely throws this out the window. You're always utilizing the hub a lot, but in very different ways. Sometimes you're going through it in one direction, and then later on in the game you're going on a completely different route through it. So it never feels like you're getting tired of Firelink Shrine. You're never using it in the same way, so when you do show back up, it's a pleasant surprise. It's memorable from the time you spent there, but not so numbly forgettable because you tediously kept warping back there. Even the NPCs hanging around aren't static. As you progress through the game, certain triggers are reached and they might move around or go on their own journeys. You might even come back to Firelink Shrine to find something drastic has changed and now you need to rearrange your whole mental map. And all of this is great, and makes for gameplay mechanics that I think completely set it apart from most of its other siblings. But a lot of that starts to fall apart in the second half of Dark Souls 1. And I think a lot of people chalk this up to how unfinished the second half of the game is. And I'm not saying at all that that has nothing to do with it. Because boy, some of this placeholder stuff is really, really awful. Immediately the second you gain the ability to warp between bonfires, you have completely negated any purpose to Firelink Shrine, or any bonfires in strategic locations. This is mitigated a bit by not all bonfires showing up as warpable locations, but really you can practically get anywhere you want. You can level up at any bonfire, you're far enough that all the boxes cost less than the lint in your pockets. All the shortcuts that really made the first half of the game shine mean nothing anymore. Suddenly all these design choices aren't working with the pace of the game. 3 out of the 4 late game routes are almost entirely linear, and the one that still does have a bunch of shortcuts and exploration has some of the worst shortcuts in the whole game. And I mean, it makes sense. Once you give the player the ability to blip around the whole game world, why would players care about shortcuts anymore? There ends up with no difference between finding a new bonfire and finding a shortcut to an old one, as opposed to the first half of the game where finding a shortcut to an old bonfire is more hype than beating a boss. I think it's no wonder that these later areas are looked so down upon by the fanbase. It's like playing a game where halfway through they just strip out the important foundations. And none of this is necessary. They didn't need to have all these later areas just dead end on you. They could have had some teleporty thing in Anor Londo that just zaps you between the boss room and Firelink. It doesn't even need to be elaborate or have some kind of transitional area between. Just stick an elevator or teleporter there or something. But it feels like later Souls-like games barely learn from this at all. It just baffles me. I don't get it. I can only imagine that everyone talking up the difficulty just put all the focus on that, maybe? Either way, when these gameplay elements are really given the opportunity to synergize, the pace of Dark Souls 1 becomes completely unlike any other Souls game. It's not dying over and over again to the same enemy that makes me remember an area from Dark Souls 1. It's those moments when you open a door and recognizing, wait, I know this door, or riding an elevator and realizing, oh, thank God it's Firelink. Getting sent back to an old bonfire with a completely new path opened up does more than just give you a new area to explore. It stacks your memories of the early game and late game to make this perfect concoction. I am convinced that this is why the game is so memorable. I don't think it's the dying over and over. I don't think it's the slick controls, though Dark Souls has some pretty slick controls. I don't think it's the co-op or the PvP. Dark Souls 1 is a master of pacing and level design. And while later games have made a lot of needed improvements, none of them really fully capture this feeling or design ever again. I wish I could just see into an alternate timeline where Dark Souls 2 and 3 push this design even further. I think at the very least, Dark Souls 1 is going to be a game people really remember, even as the other Souls-like sort of fade away into the past. I think there's a lot further you could push this concept, and I think whatever lucky dev figures out how best to do that first is going to have another Insta franchise on their hands.